Today, the saga of making the diorama base for my Warhound Titan comes to a close. I'm putting all those final details on it: shell casings, dead bodies, tank traps, and barbed wire barricades. And it's because of you all supporting the project, your huge amount of love, your comments, telling me to take my time and really just do the best I can with this one. So I'm super stoked to be able to share the final parts of the process with you as we close the book on this chapter of my Warhound Titan project. This video is sponsored by Tacticus, and we'll be talking about their 4th anniversary event later in the video. Enough intro, it's time for me to Attack on Titan project.
Shame!
So we are in the home stretch now of basing this Titan, and a large part of what's left to do is making the top surfaces of these trenches look awesome. The blank that I had sculpted has these spherical cutouts that are designed to make me have to use less texture paste when I'm surfacing this thing, but they do look a little inorganic, which means the very first thing I'm going to do is take out my rotary tool with a grinder bit and come in at all sorts of angles, carving away at the edges of this crater. I'm using a motion that pulls up in vertical lines to try and emulate the blast wave of a crater, and I'm also not doing this uniformly. In this way, I'm grinding deeper in some areas and leaving others untouched, which will create a natural variance across the rim of each crater lip. Also, between each individual crater, I am doing this to a greater or lesser extent, trying to differentiate the different ages of these impacts. Having gone across the board and ground away all of those pesky corners and making this look a bit more organic, I can move on to the next step, which is sandbags. You thought after the last video I was done with sandbags? Not a chance. But I'm gonna keep it brief because I've talked about sandbags too much in this series.
What are you talking to me?
All I'm doing here is adding some sandbags along the back wall of the trench to keep it consistent with the rest of the areas I've already done. Then I'm focusing on building up the front wall. This is the combat facing wall, so I'm doing a double thick row of sandbags that builds up in height up to 4 bags in some areas. And because putty takes time to dry, I have to do this in rows, basically doing a full row down and then a full row back, waiting for them to dry and building up in this manner. I make sure to have areas where it's inconsistent or some sandbags have been blown out or knocked out by the Titan. And as I do each layer of front-facing bags, I also use a sculpting tool, a knife, and a toothpick to gouge out bullet holes, deforming the bags, dragging areas down, and basically just creating a bunch of mayhem that indicates this has been shot at several times. Commenter JMan5675 said in a previous video to do a machine gun emplacement, and I quite liked the idea, but I knew there would be a problem with it. You see, all of the guard heavy weapons are absolutely massive next to guardsmen. When you really look at them, they take up so much area. And looking at the board, I feel like there weren't any significant dugouts or spaces I'd left for a proper emplacement for heavy weaponry. Thankfully, however, I did find this compact heavy bolter on a sort of a gimbal, and I quite like the small footprint that this fixture would have. To make this feel more realistic though, in the area that I was putting the heavy gun, I curved out the sandbags in a semicircle and stacked them even higher than the rest of the wall. This does leave a pair of guardsman arms clinging onto the gunnery of a heavy bolter, but we'll deal with that a bit later in the video. Any leftover milliput from the sandbag sculpting was used to create spare bags I could loosely throw around or to stick on the edges of those crater rims. This helped to further accentuate the elevation differences and ensure the edges of the craters weren't uniform. Now, it was really important to me that these big open areas on the top of the trenches were decorated in style. It would have been easy to just put some texture over them and leave them, but I wanted to create something really special. For me, an iconic part of any scene in a World War I or World War II movie are the tank traps. And I'm going for the very iconic Czech hedgehog style of tank trap. Now, to hand make these tank traps, I use L-shaped pieces of plasticard. I can then cut out thin squares of plasticard and glue them on at the center points, and grab a tube of plasticard and basically just clip off really small parts in a length, and these are making my large rivets or bolts. Using some reference images, I can copy the design of the hedgehog, cutting out a wedge from the second square panel and joining together all 3 struts. Anywhere where they join, I use those bits of plasticard I'd cut out to create bolts. And overall, this was not a particularly difficult craft project, but I'm really happy with the effect. You can achieve this with 3 plasticard products from Evergreen Scenics, and for an Australian, it'll total you probably $30 for all of those parts, and you'll be able to make quite a lot of tank traps. I imagine you'll be seeing more of it on the channel in the future. With one pristine tank trap built, I need another one. That's the exact example that's going on top of the base. However, I'm all for symbolism, and a tank trap is designed to stop a tank in its tracks. The symbolism of a Titan being completely undeterred by these would be best captured by having it crush one. To do this, rather than gluing together all the elements of a tank trap, I built them separately, taking time to use a knife to score out damage, bend the square plastic card, and a drill to create areas where bolts had been shorn out by the colossal forces imparted by the Titan's footfall. Segments assembled, I could use a heat gun to melt them down, as well as a knife and clippers to cut them into shape, and create an aesthetically broken tank trap crammed around the front foot of the Titan. Anywhere where this doesn't quite look right will be fixed with mud and putty to hide those areas. I think these turned out awesome, so it's time to move to the front of the trench and work on another element that is iconic for these kinds of battlefields. That, of course, is barbed wire. There were heaps of comments about barbed wire in my previous videos and how I might utilize it, with lots of those comments interested in it wrapping around and dragging around the feet in mid-step. I've already done this on a Chaos Knight, and I actually feel like a Titan should be above this. With the sheer forces involved simply tearing and demolishing these trench works, the idea of it wrapping around its ankles to me demeans the Titan, even if it probably would happen. But don't worry, I have other plans. BlueDog843 mentioned how layered and tangled the barbed wire on trench battlefields actually was. So I took a good look at a bunch of reference photos. I went through several different examples and ultimately settled on one that I like the look of. These seem to be pre-created X frames of wood that are positioned into place and then barbed wire is strung around. So to create the frames, I shaved down matchsticks, cutting them into shape, and much as I had with the balsa wood, I could then use a knife to nick and cut into them, create the illusion that they are old, weathered, and battle damaged. With the timber frame glued together, it's time for me to string the barbed wire, and I can bring out a true relic. You can get this from other brands, but this here is the OG Games Workshop barbed wire, and I hate that they stopped making this. This is my last piece of it from the glory days, and I'm going to be putting it to good use on another classic model from the glory days, this Warhound Titan. Using my hands, I increase the circumference of the barbed wire, and then I feed it over the X frames that I've made, wrapping it on the top of each of the strut, but ensuring the coil of razor wire is still really obvious and present in the middle. I can then stretch out individual lengths of barbed wire, just straightening the curved barbed wire and clipping them off with some wire cutters. With these, I can attach them along the tops and the bottoms of the frame, creating an absolute nightmare mesh of barbed wire. So I build two, and with two built to completion, it's time to destroy my work. Now, before I smash it, I just want to address the question, why do it this way? Why go to the effort of building a pristine piece just to break it? Well, it's pretty simple. I want this diorama to look as good as I possibly can. And to make it look like there is the correct quantity of timber and wire crushed under the Titan's foot, I want to ensure that the wire is accurately attached to all of the individual pieces. That way, when it breaks, it will remain attached to the bits of wood, and there'll be a continuity in its form. So I grab one of my beautiful frames and shove it back behind the front foot of the Titan, deliberately breaking it, stretching it, bending it, and putting it into position. There's something a little bit traumatizing about destroying your work and satisfying at the same time as I do this. With these pieces broken, I can then come around the front of the model and use pliers and glue to manipulate the individual shards, making it look a bit more aesthetic. Then I can position the second wire barricade open in the trenches and string a few extra bits of barbed wire between the two and down under the foot to create a sense of continuity between the two pieces. I'm really happy with how this is looking, but once I texture paste it into the base, it's going to look a lot better, trust me. For 3 years, I have been an avid player of Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, and they are celebrating their 4th anniversary. Alongside the usual host of premium offers and freebies, there is a brand new game event, which is the Epic Crusade game mode. This allows you to choose your faction, whether you're going to side with the Imperials or bring devastation alongside the Xenos or Chaos forces. Once chosen, battle for supremacy over a series of planets over a series of weeks. I've been a huge fan of the Thousand Suns faction within the game, as well as the Mechanicus faction. They're my raid team who I use the most. So I'll have trouble deciding which one to pick, but that decision might be swayed a little bit because there is also a brand new character that is available now in a 2-week character release event. And this one's got me really excited because it combines chaos with mechanical. So I can get my 2 favorite things in one, and that is the Sekitar Battle Automata. I think the reason I've stuck with Tacticus is the game has so many different game modes. For those who are interested in competitive PvP, there's tournament arena events. And for those more like me who prefer to challenge themselves and their roster to take on harder and harder PvE events, there's amazing legendary release events where you can actually unlock certain characters at legendary rarity. This variety means there's always something new to try or something that suits everyone's playstyle. There's actually so much more coming in August than we can cover. It's easier for you to just use the link in our description or scan the QR code to go download the game and check it out. Give it a try. We also have a special code for some goodies in game, which is TTT for Crusade. But now that you've used the QR code and downloaded the game, I think it's time to get back to basing this Titan. Before I can put texture on, there are some other elements to do, and the main one is some corpses. I promised corpses on this project, and I'm going to deliver. However, I do have an issue. You see, I actually don't have an abundance of Imperial Guard bodies to use, and the big thing I have in shortage are legs. I do have 3 bodies left in this old Cadian command squad, and I'm going to stretch them as far as I can. So the first body is going to go near that back leg of the Titan, and to do this, I get 2 sets of legs from the Cadian kit, chop them in half and glue them together. This is to create a look of a natural falling pose, taking the foreleg from a kneeling body with the hind leg of a walking body and gluing them together, carving it down and meshing it into place. I cut a lot of the front of these legs off as well as the feet so they will sink adequately into the ground, and then I mix up a little ball of putty, stick it onto the base to create some bulk effectively, and then just squish in the back part of a Cadian torso. I use nippers to slice a head fully in half and then glue that into place as well, face buried in the dirt. The positioning of the far left toe on the Titan means that this soldier's arm has been fully squished into the dirt, so I only need to focus on the left arm, cutting and gluing a piece into place with another bit of putty just to bulk it out. The great thing with corpses buried in the dirt is anywhere it doesn't look great, you just cover with texture paste, but there's more corpses to do before then. The next one is the most efficient use of parts, using one of the single legs I had left over, as well as a Cadian hand holding a las rifle. I positioned this really close to where the Titan had stepped, so you can imagine that the remainder of his body is either crushed into the dirt or buried in the mound of dirt that it will have thrown up as it stepped. The last body or bodies on the front of this diorama, because it's unclear if it's one guy or 2, are created by placing the remaining leg, that half leg, remember I said I was going to use everything, gluing it, sliding down into this crater, and then another body, a back half of a torso, a head sliced in half, and a knife holding arm, which I carved so I can put it in a kind of unnatural angle, all placed on the left of that crater. I carved the bottom of the Cadian torso off and made it nice and ragged, and then I could use some putty to finish telling this story. Yes, those little squiggles I've sculpted are becoming the intestines falling out of these corpses. Now I imagine these bodies have probably been here for a while. It's no man's land and no one has the capacity to clean up these trench bodies until there's a break in the fighting. And when I paint it, I'm really going to get to play with that horror with the different colors and tones I put into these bodies in the trenches. I also sculpt some mangled parts of the arm, anywhere where there were limbs that were severed, and it would be harder for me to hide with the texture paste. Then I can superglue some rocks in and bring back that Bear Cavalry paste. The texture putty they did with Trench Crusade that I've been using and I'm going to run out of on this project. This is a very thick paste and it is good for building up the mounds next to each of the toes where it has mushed the dirt and created rises. Here that mushed dirt is being used to great effect to disguise the bodies and seamlessly blend them into the base. I then use the thinner of my texture pastes in the flatter areas of the diorama and use a toothpick to drag along, especially at the center back toe of the Titan, where it has crushed the trench and is sliding back to lift up. The corpses are now glued in, the texture paste is in, the tank traps and barbed wire are incorporated into the board seamlessly, and we're nearing the finish line. But the next thing to do is add a lot of tiny details to the trenches. I collect a heap of plastic parts from my spare guardsman collection and spare sprues. Notably, we've got weapon crates, canteens, loose las guns, fuel cans, and for some reason, the Ogren kit has heaps of these massive explosive rounds. I know it's from one of their frag launchers or whatever, I just don't really understand why the kit has so many of them where there's no way to put them on the models effectively. I don't know, maybe they loaded into them. I've never built that configuration, I went with the shield Bullgrins. What matters is I can cut the tip of them off and drill out the hole a little bit and create spare Lehman Russ shells, discarded shells that have been thrown out of the tank and are laying around on the trench surfaces. Lehman Russes have stupid tank barrels. Their law caliber or bore is completely at odds with the actual size of the barrels, and also this sculpted ammunition that Games Workshop has made in the past. But thankfully, it doesn't matter for me. The shell looks like a shell, and the Lehman Russ has no turret. Did it have a Nova cannon, a Vanquisher cannon, a Demolisher cannon, or just a battle cannon? Because we don't know, the shells will work regardless. With all these parts collected and those shells glued onto the base, the thing that I've really noticed is missing is there are no spare las gun magazines magazines. Despite the fact that they're rechargeable in a trench works like this, I can imagine spare reloads or discarded mags lying around in the chaos. And while I have avoided 3D printing in this diorama, I'm going to make an exception. But that's only because I'm going to be the one sculpting the things that I 3D print. So I run to Blender and I sculpt some small lasgun magazines and some transport trays. I see these as an energy magazine equivalent to an ammunition box. Just a quick way to store and transport multiple magazines for the lasguns. Here I also make a small trench light with a channel for wires and I print them all up. I have a great time decorating the base with all of these various components, and it might be time for a little bit of a satisfying montage. With the components scattered around, I move on to the trench lights. These are a complicated issue in real World War I trenches because, well, people didn't want to wave a flag and say where the important things were. It kind of put a target on you at nighttime. So a lot of the lighting was focused or indoors or hooded lanterns, things where you could really control the lights. However, it's 40K and I don't really care. The Imperium does things the way they do, so I'm going to string up several of these lights with some wire, gluing them onto the matchstick posts, but then deliberately severing the wire where one of these craters has hit the trench wall. I don't actually want to paint these lights as on. The diorama isn't designed to be a nighttime diorama, but this kind of thing will just add a little bit more detail and I think will make the trenches look that bit more 40K rather than, you know, World War I. Then I wanted to address the terribly barren old Lehman Russ kit by putting some tank stowage on the back of it. There are some bundles of backpacks, shovels, and gear, as well as fuel tanks I could glue onto the back here. But to add a little bit more life to the diorama, I also wanted to add an area where the stowage was thrown clear by the explosion. To do this, I get a small strip of plastic card, bend it, twist it, and shape it, and then glue on only one portion of it. Then use a drill to indicate where it had torn out of the other side of the tank. I can then throw this discarded fuel tank somewhere else on the diorama, and we all know where it's come from. I can also scatter some loose gear across the back of the tank that has just fallen out of its holdings and kind of gone everywhere. I think these little details do help that back of the tank, which looked a bit bare, look a bit more realistic and suitable seated in this diorama. Finally, it's the absolute last part of my trench diorama. It's the last remaining corpses. I would love to do more of these. However, I currently just have no more bodies to use, so I'm going to do what I can. The main thing I really wanted to do is have a cowering guardsman who is still alive, clutching his head in his hands. When I paint this, I'm going to have blood pouring out of his ears because I imagine the Chaos Titan's Warhound has just blown out his eardrums. And it adds to the scene of horror having a single survivor who, well, we know he's not going to be surviving for much longer. This was a difficult one to make because I had to effectively hodgepodge together some crouching or sitting legs and then cut a bunch of arms and use some milliput to fill the gaps until I could get a pose that adequately looked like hands over his ears. But with a bit of elbow grease, putty, and pluck, I've got a nice model that I can pose right at the juncture at that center sight line to show the full desperation of the diorama. The heavy bolter emplacement definitely needs a corpse on it, leaning and sagging into the wall of the trench. He's been shot while operating the weapon, but to manipulate his body into place, I do need to use a little bit of putty, slicing up some guardsman limbs and reconnecting them at a more organic slumped angle. With one arm up over the trench, one arm still holding the gun, and his body leaning, the last thing is his head. And I decided I was just going to blow this out. I'm also going to use a grinder to carve out a channel in the sandbag. So we can imagine that this guy maybe got his head like vaporized by a las cannon or something. This was not light munitions, and he's gone. And lastly, I make a heaped body slumped in the trench. Another face down corpse similar to the ones on the surface, but this time I can't hide any of the details with texture paste. With the corpses in place, it's time to finally take a look at my completed Titan base. Thank you all so much to our wonderful patrons who support us in making all of our videos. I do a behind the scenes update over there, and we also have our monthly mini review. There's a heap of reasons to check it out, or perhaps you just want to join our exclusive Discord community. Supporting the Patreon is the best way to support the channel, and the links are in the description. More than just a Titan, I have really created a display piece here, and I hope you've enjoyed coming on the journey with me. This isn't the last time we'll be seeing my Titan. Obviously, I need to paint it, but I think for the sake of diversity on the channel and also for my upper back, which has been hunched over a table for the last 3 weeks working on this, we'll put it to bed for a little while, probably a month or so before the next video, where we can come back and start the journey of painting the Titan. And with the rate I'm going, it might even be finished this year. Let's see if I can get my Titan finished before my baby turns 1. I have some ideas. I'm thinking I'm not going to paint it the way I painted my test model for Titanicus. I'm just going to change the paint job of Legiosilla. And the reason for that is I always paint teal, blue, gold, black, and all of those colors. I don't know, I want to do something different. And I was thinking, with it being called Legiosilla and being interested in things like the Odyssey, we've got a roleplay on Tabletop roleplay called Mythos, which is set in like a Greek fantasy setting. I'm actually thinking of kind of coloring it more like the classics. So I was thinking white marble, maybe black marble threaded with gold, and then doing some of those Hellenistic patterns that you see on pottery and things, maybe some freehand in areas. So that's what I'm thinking. Anyway, look, thanks again to you all for watching. Thanks to Tacticus for sponsoring the video, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!